A shepherd tosses a stone into a cliffside hole, and the sound that answers rewrites scripture. For nearly 2,000 years, fragile pages slept in darkness, sealed inside clay jars, waiting for one unlucky goat, one curious hand, and one moment of disbelief. And when they finally surfaced, they didn't just add footnotes to history, they forced scholars to recheck the entire blueprint. What exactly was hidden out there, and why did someone go to such trouble to make sure no one found it? Today, I'm taking you through the Dead Sea Scrolls, how they emerged, what they contain, and the unsettling story of the people who may have risked everything to protect them. But stay with me, because the closer we read, the stranger it gets. The name is simple. These writings were uncovered near the Dead Sea, that harsh, low basin of salt water between modern Israel, the West Bank, and Jordan. The caves dot the cliffs above the shoreline, and many cluster beside the ruins of a place called Qumran. Broken walls and a lonely landscape, like the remains of a life someone tried to erase. Most accounts place the first discovery in 1947, credited to Bedouin shepherds. The telling changes depending on who's speaking. Every retelling polishes the drama, but the core is consistent enough to follow. A young herder, often named Mohammed Ed-Dib, was searching for missing animals along the cliffs. One wandered toward a cave opening. He climbed after it, half annoyed, half worried, and stepped into a hollow that didn't look like much from the outside. Then the light caught something that didn't belong. Tall ceramic jars lined along the wall, untouched, as if someone had set them down and promised to return. He opened one and found a rolled bundle wrapped tight, the surface still intact. Imagine realizing you're holding writing that has waited longer than any human memory around you. Would you think artifact, or would you think sale? He carried the scrolls toward Bethlehem and, not knowing their value, traded them for a small sum money that sounds laughable now, but was meaningful in the moment. Soon rumors moved faster than the desert wind. Dealers whispered, scholars leaned in. And eventually, the news reached researchers like John C. Trevor at the American School of Oriental Research, who recognized that the script looked ancient, older than most surviving Hebrew manuscripts anyone had handled. One cave could be an accident. But what if it wasn't? What if the jars weren't a single stash, but part of a whole system? That question pulled archaeologists toward Qumran like a magnet. With local help, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, more caves were located. Not 2 or 3, 11. And inside a flood of texts, many shattered into fragments, yet preserved far beyond what anyone thought possible in that climate. The story turned international. Notices even appeared in newspapers announcing scrolls for sale, including one famous advertisement in the Wall Street Journal. By 1954, some of the earliest scrolls ended up purchased for $250,000, millions in today's value. The world now knew something enormous had been found. The only problem was the hardest part hadn't even started yet. Because scrolls makes you picture neat rolls you can read by lamplight. The reality was closer to disaster cleanup. Across the collection, scholars identified roughly 900 separate manuscripts. Many weren't scrolls at all anymore, just crumbs, thousands of pieces, often only a few centimeters wide. If you're watching on a phone, that about the scale, tiny scraps that had to be sorted, matched, and assembled like the most unforgiving puzzle ever created. Once the fragments began to form pages again, researchers categorized what they were seeing. Around 40% mirrored books that would later appear in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Psalms, and so on. Another portion, around 30%, matched writings that later traditions would label outside or non-canonical texts like Enoch and Jubilees. But the remaining third was the real shock. Documents unknown to modern scholarship, describing a closed community, its rules, and its end-of-days expectations. And yes, one text was hammered into copper, listing locations of hidden wealth like a taunt. Hold that thought. Early on, scholars suspected the manuscripts belonged to the Second Temple era. Later, carbon dating helped confirm it. The materials range roughly from the 3rd century BCE through the 1st century CE. That the window, which means these are among the oldest surviving copies of biblical material ever discovered. The impact is hard to exaggerate. The scrolls offer a direct look at how sacred texts circulated, changed, stabilized, and sometimes fractured across generations. So what do they actually say? Let's begin with the familiar pieces, because even there the surprises are sharp. Fragments from nearly every book of the Hebrew Bible show up at Qumran. One book is notably absent, Esther, perhaps because its setting is Persian or because it never explicitly names God. But among the biblical manuscripts, one stands like a monument, the great Isaiah scroll. It's massive, about 7 meters long, and astonishingly readable. The ink still holds, the Hebrew still flows, and you can almost feel the scribe rhythm across the page. Now here's the detail that makes people sit upright. Compare this ancient Isaiah to a modern Bible, and the match is overwhelmingly close. Roughly 95% aligns, with many differences boiling down to spelling or small variations. That suggests something profound, at least for Isaiah. The text was already largely fixed long before many imagined. But the Bible didn't arrive as a single sealed product. It was written over centuries, edited, copied, and recopied, sometimes carefully, sometimes not. The scrolls expose that process in a way no lecture ever could. Some manuscripts preserve alternative versions of stories we thought we knew. Sometimes the change is trivial, numbers, measurements, a name form. Sometimes it's startling missing lines, extra paragraphs, or different narrative logic. Take a version of Samuel that includes an additional section about Nahash, king of the Ammonites. In the familiar Bible, Nahash appears suddenly, and the thread can feel awkward, like a scene started mid-sentence. But in the Qumran copy, there's an extra paragraph that sets up his rise and brutal campaigns. Many scholars see that longer version as earlier, and they suspect a copyist once skipped the passage by accident, often because two sections began with similar wording, causing the eye to jump. Book an ordinary mistake multiplied by centuries. That discovery creates a tension that isn't just academic. If you find an older reading, do you revise sacred scripture to match it, or do you preserve the traditional form because it became holy through use? What would you want if it were your community text? Beyond biblical books, the scrolls also preserve writings later labeled apocryphal. Pieces of Enoch appear famous for its watchers and giant offspring traditions. Another oddity is the Genesis Apocryphon, which presents itself like an expanded retelling of Genesis, more scenes, more detail, more drama around the flood era and the rebellion of heavenly beings drawn toward human women. It even contains an extended meditation on Sarah Beauty, so lavishly described you can almost hear a reader raising an eyebrow and asking, was this really essential? And here the key caution: terms like biblical and apocryphal are modern sorting labels. In the scroll's own world, the boundaries were likely blurrier. Some texts may have carried authority locally without ever becoming universal. The library at Qumran shows a living religious ecosystem, not a finalized table of contents. Now, the most fascinating part of the collection isn't the familiar books or the famous outsiders. It's the material that seems to belong to the community itself. The documents that read like an internal handbook, an identity manifesto, and a forecast of the end. Before we open that door, remember, people don't hide ordinary paperwork in desert caves. They hide what they cannot afford to lose. Let's start with the strangest non-religious text of all, the Copper Scroll. Unlike parchment or papyrus, this one is metal-thin sheets engraved with writing. When it was found, it couldn't simply be unrolled. It had to be cut open carefully with specialized tools. And when scholars finally translated it, they realized it wasn't a prayer or prophecy, it was a list, a treasure inventory, a map written like a ledger. Entry after entry names a site and then describes buried valuables, gold, silver, vessels, sometimes measured in talents, a weight that, when converted, implies staggering quantities. One line suggests caches approaching half a ton. But before you start planning an expedition, two problems slam the brakes. First, the location descriptions can be maddeningly vague, written like directions only insiders would understand. Second, people have searched. So far, the ground has given up nothing definitive. So what is the Copper Scroll? Some think it records the hidden treasury of the Jerusalem temple concealed during a crisis. Others think it's symbolic or exaggerated or tied to a different story entirely. But the most honest answer may be the simplest: we don't know. The scroll offers a promise and then refuses to cash it. Now we move into the texts that feel like the heartbeat of the collection writings that describe a disciplined, secretive sect. The most famous is often called the Community Rule, and it reads like a constitution. It outlines membership, behavior, punishments, and ritual life. There's a silent economic war happening right now, and most people are completely missing the real target. For the last few months, we've been focused on the headlines, the political drama, the market swings, the feeling of instability right here at home. I thought that was the core of the issue. But I've come to realize there's a much larger, more dangerous game being played on a global scale, and our position in that game is weakening by the day. What's at stake isn't just a policy debate, it's the foundation of our economic power. You see, I've spent decades analyzing how systems function, from corporate empires to entire economies. The fundamental deer in the line was disagrees with thing. There's even a scene that sounds like an initiation ceremony, newcomers confessing wrongdoing, entering a covenant, speaking a communal amen, and surrendering their private lives to the group order. Joining wasn't casual. Applicants had to hand over property and live under supervision for a long trial period, sometimes described as 2 years before being fully admitted. The ideal was purity, prayer, study, and strict obedience to divine law, but the enforcement was blunt. Some penalties are almost darkly comedic in their specificity. Foolish speech could earn months of discipline. Certain gestures could earn days of penance. It's the kind of detail that makes the community feel uncomfortably realist, like legend, more like a place you could have walked into and immediately worried about your posture. Because of these community texts, many scholars have argued that this sect were the caretakers, perhaps the authors, of the library. But who were they in the broader landscape of Judaism at the time? During the Second Temple era, Judaism was not a single uniform block. It revolved around the temple in Jerusalem, rebuilt after exile, and different movements competed for influence: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and others. One group, described in ancient sources yet often overlooked in popular retellings, were the Essenes. Contemporary writers like Josephus depict the Essenes as austere, communal, and suspicious of luxury-sharing goods, rejecting excess, living in disciplined communities. Another Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, describes a solitary people near the Dead Sea, living without wealth and far from the usual world. Those descriptions sound eerily compatible with what the community rule demands: property in common, strict initiation, shared life. This is why the Essene hypothesis became a dominant theory. The idea that the Qumran community were Essenes and the scrolls were their library. Yet the case isn't airtight. The manuscripts never plainly use the label Essenes, and scholars still argue about whether the texts represent one unified sect or a broader movement. Still, the overlap is strong enough that many researchers accept the Essene link as the best available explanation, even if it remains a well-supported inference rather than a stamped certainty. But even if we grant that, a bigger mystery remains. Why hide the texts in caves at all? Why not keep them in a safer building? The ruins at Qumran may hold part of the answer. Archaeologists excavated the site and found features that fit communal religious life: shared dining areas, sleeping quarters, and a ritual bath. Some interpreted it as monastery-like, though monastery is a later word for an earlier reality. More haunting is the evidence that the settlement ended abruptly. There's a burn layer dated to the 1st century, suggesting destruction, not a slow abandonment, something violent, something urgent. To understand that urgency, you have to look at the year 70 CE. Judea was in revolt against Rome. The rebellion escalated, and Rome responded with the kind of force empires used to teach lessons. Under Titus, Roman legions crushed Jerusalem, and ancient accounts describe slaughter, fire, and terror echoing off stone. The temple, the center of religious life, was torn down and plundered. Today, the Western Wall remains as a scar and a sanctuary. The conflict didn't stop at Jerusalem. It spread through towns and countryside. If a sect near the Dead Sea watched the Roman machine roll closer, hiding sacred writings would suddenly become a survival plan. The most plausible scenario is also the most tragic. They placed their library into caves for safekeeping, expecting to retrieve it after the storm passed. But the storm did not pass for them. They never came back. And if you lived through that, wouldn't it feel like the world was ending? Wouldn't ancient prophecies suddenly look less like poetry and more like headlines? That mood is exactly what we meet in the final major category of scrolls. Texts soaked in spiritual warfare and apocalyptic expectation. Many documents from Qumran reveal a universe crowded with unseen forces. One section, often called the Treatise of the Two Spirits, describes humanity divided under opposing influences, a prince of light guiding the righteous, and an angel of darkness steering deception. The worldview is intensely dualistic reality split into light versus shadow, loyalty versus rebellion, truth versus corruption. And this dualism sometimes shows up in places that are frankly unsettling. One text offers a kind of moral assessment based on physical features, suggesting that beauty, teeth alignment, and bodily traits could indicate spiritual origin. Crooked teeth, hairy thighs, thick toes, the implications are harsh, and it reads like a reminder that ancient communities could be just as judgmental and imaginative as any modern one. Hovering behind these ideas is a recurring villain, not exactly Satan in the familiar later sense, but a figure often rendered as Belial. In these writings, Belial becomes the source of wickedness, the patron of rebellion, the name that collects darkness into a single silhouette. What's fascinating is how language itself may have shaped this demon. Earlier Hebrew usage can treat the term as a descriptor, worthlessness or wickedness, not necessarily a personal name. Over time, as communities retold and reinterpreted, the word hardened into an entity, a label turned into a being. Sometimes a single word grows teeth over centuries. In the scrolls, you can trace that development, the term shifting from abstract evil toward a distinct, commanding antagonist. By later texts, Belial is almost a prince of the dark, a rival power in the cosmic drama. That leads directly into the most cinematic document in the collection, the War Scroll. The War Scroll doesn't describe a conflict that already happened. It lays out a battle that, to its authors, was still ahead, a blueprint for an end-time confrontation. On one side stand the sons of light, aligned with God. Opposing them are the sons of darkness, devoted to Belial. Among the enemies appear the Kittim, often interpreted as a code for the Romans, the empire that for many Jews of the era looked like a beast in human armor. The text details a war stretching across 40 years, with repeated clashes that refuse to resolve. Neither side gains a final advantage. Then in the last phase, the invisible world breaks the surface. Angels join the righteous, led by Michael. Demonic forces reinforce the darkness. The conflict hits a deadlock until the decisive intervention. God acts and the enemy power is annihilated. The tone is thunderous, like a script for Judgment Day written by people who believed history was about to snap in half. When history burns, prophecy feels like a timetable. It's hard not to wonder, did the authors think they were already living inside this war? Did the Roman advance, the temple destruction, the collapse of order, did all of it look like confirmation? If your world is falling apart, the idea of cosmic meaning can feel like the only remaining structure. And this is why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so much more than old Bible pages. They are among the greatest archaeological discoveries ever made, precisely because they don't just answer questions, they multiply them. They provide the earliest biblical manuscript evidence we have for many passages, showing remarkable stability in some places and startling variation in others. They reveal how texts were copied, edited, and transmitted, sometimes with extreme care, sometimes with human error. They also open a window into Second Temple religious life, the hopes, anxieties, and daily discipline of a sect that believed they were the faithful remnant in a corrupted world. Whether that sect were Essenes or something close, the scrolls preserve an interior voice that history almost swallowed. And perhaps most hauntingly, they show how people facing violence interpreted their moment through spiritual conflict, light against darkness, until the line between politics and apocalypse blurred. So here my question to you: if you found evidence that a cherished text had earlier variations, would you want modern editions updated, or would you keep the traditional form untouched? And if you want a deeper dive into any specific scroll, the Copper Scroll, the Community Rule, the War Scroll, tell me which one and why. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the only buried library recovered from oblivion. Other texts surfaced with even more controversy, especially early Christian writings that claim to record forbidden teachings and rival gospels. If you want that story next, you'll want to see what those manuscripts dared to say. If you enjoyed this video, please like the video and subscribe for more videos. Your comments help more than you'd think, so drop a question or a theory below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.